David, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Happy to. And thanks for having me, Tom. I'm David Van Deusen. I'm president of the Vermont AFL-CIO, longtime union member, longtime labor leader, and head of the Progressive United Slate, which is our group that's in office now here in the Green Mountains.
Cool. Could you tell me more about your goals and aspirations? What are you guys working towards?
Well, look, if you follow organized labor, really for the last 50, 60 years, frankly, we've been in decline. For a long time now, on a national scale, the AFL-CIO and the unions have tended to hitch their wagon to the Democratic Party. Now, what has that delivered us? Very little. We have put our resources into elections where we get folks elected that, frankly, don't really represent our interests, don't go to bat for us when it matters, don't get the laws passed after we put them there. And instead of putting enough resources towards organizing and getting more workers into the labor movement, we put an exorbitant amount of resources into lobbying, which again, if you look at the PRO Act or under Obama, when the Democrats controlled all branches of government again, the Employee Free Choice Act, none of those things passed. They're talking points on a campaign trail, but when push comes to shove, when the Democrats are actually in power, we don't get them. So we've gone from 35% union membership rate nationally in the United States of America since the 1950s, down to roughly about 10% today. Now, the Vermont AFL-CIO from 2019 on, we decided to change course. We decided that enough is enough and we need to try a new path. And that is where our slate, united, ran for office, swept elections, swept 3 elections in a row, and we're trying to turn things around. We took money out of lobbying. We put it into organizing. We have on-call organizers that are assisting our affiliates across the state at any given time. And we're not afraid to call a spade, and we've created distance between ourselves and the Democratic Party.
Cool. How did you accomplish this? How did you actually get money out of lobbying? Is it just a voluntary choice?
Well, the way it works is, of course, we have a budget like anybody else, and we're talking about dues money here. And frankly, dues money is sacred, right? It's a group of workers that pool together some resources so they have some power against the bosses. And traditionally, what happened is a percentage of that money would always go into supporting, in addition to our staff, and outside lobbyists to help us with the State House and things like this. We put an end to that on day one. After we won our first election, we were not just the majority, but the supermajority on the governing board. We took that money straight out. We put it into what we call a program of on-call organizers who could work a week here or work a week there, assist an affiliate here on a new drive or internal organizing drive, because we figure our real power is never going to be as working class people, a couple of people wearing ties, be it in Montpelier, our capital, or Washington, D.C. Our real power is when we organize a critical mass of folks, of working people, to stand up and define what their priorities are. And if we could build that power on the ground, if we could organize new shops, more shops, many shops, then the politicians, be they Republican or Democrat, will follow. In the 1930s, it wasn't just that FDR snapped his fingers, decided to do the right thing, and we had the New Deal. There were hundreds of thousands and millions of workers across this country withholding their labor, going on strike, marching by the thousands to say change has to come. And then the politicians followed. So we see our path to creating real working class power, not with the politicians, not with the Democrats or Republicans, but by developing our own solidarity and our own strength within factories, within job sites, in stores, in warehouses, etc.
And how do you plan to do that? How do you plan to gain enough support to be able to make an influence in changing politicians' minds?
Well, they do what is right, not because it's right. They do what's right when they fear us. So not more than an hour and a half ago today, I was in Burlington, our largest city, for a union election where the clerical workers in the school district there came together and said, we're tired of these crappy raises. Inflation is at 7-8%. It's time for us to form a union so we could collectively bargain, leverage our collective power to get a better deal, a fairer deal. Nothing, crazy, but fair. And it's time for that to happen. So within the last few months, we've organized a number of new shops. Workers have organized largely as well on their own. And one of our affiliates, the American Federation of Teachers up here in Vermont, which also represents university workers, has since the pandemic started, organized 1,000 or 1,500 new workers into our ranks. So there's robust organizing going on at all levels in Vermont, and part of that, an aspect of that, is being supported by the emphasis that organized labor in Vermont is putting on organizing, as opposed to lobbying politicians in elections.
A lot of employers seem to be fighting against unionizing. Specifically, I remember a recent case of Starbucks in like New York trying to unionize, and it's trying to get shut down by the organization. How do you deal with companies who are drastically opposed to unionization of their workers?
Well, I mean, that's always an issue. So when you, by various labor board standards, you need 30% of the workforce to sign a card saying that they have an interest in the union to have an election, to have a secret ballot election. The problem with that is even if you have a majority signed cards, you need to expect that the employer is going to hold captive meetings and use dirty tricks to try to change people's vote. I've had circumstances that I'm firsthand aware of where an employer at a hotel here in Vermont, this was years ago, hired private investigators to follow, shop floor union leaders home to see what they're up to after work. So those folks knew that they were being followed. And then, there's the threats of intimidation, there's terminations, things like this that happen in between the time you file for election when the election happens. Now, many of those things are illegal, but just because they're illegal, let's not be babes in the woods here and pretend that illegal shit doesn't happen, right? I mean, I'm a realist. I expect you are too. So you have to go into an election and an organizing drive knowing that that's the opposition. And one of the smart things you need to be able to do is a form of inoculation. So when you're talking with workers, when you're helping them organize, when you're looking to build the union, it's smart to tell them straight up, these are the things the employers are going to say. They're going to say, hey, we're all family here. I made some mistakes. Give me another chance. They're going to say, why do you need a third party coming in and getting between our relationship? We could take care of this ourselves. You need to be able to tell them as the organizer, all of these things they're going to hear from the boss before they hear it from the boss. And by the way, a good union is in no way a third party. The way we work our unions up here, right, is that the workers themselves are the union, and they should be the ones and are the ones that makes the decision on the shop floor level as far as what they get behind or what they don't get behind.
So could you tell me some of the advantages of a unionizing? What benefit does that have for the workers?
Well, look, I'm not making this up here. If you look at the statistics, by and large, union workplaces get paid significantly more than other folks that aren't union. They tend to have defined benefit retirement programs, real pensions, as opposed to a 401k that fluctuates with the market. Safer working conditions. National statistics will show you that a unionized workplace with safe rules, worksite rules, are going to perform better as far as not seeing injuries on the job. But it goes beyond that, right? It's not just about the worksite. It's not just about the job itself. It's also about leveraging political power in a broader way. Now, I'm skeptical about traditional elections. I think I've made that clear at the beginning of this. But at the same time, we do need to have a say when it comes to the larger things in society that tend to be driven by the media or driven by various interests. And we need to be able to have a voice to impact that, whatever the political debate or social debate or economic debate of the day is, be it universal paid family medical leave, be it moving to a notion of healthcare as a human right, be it livable wages. These are also political issues. They're economic, but they're also political. And by coming together as a union, we develop a mass voice, a strength in numbers, because let's not forget the working class are 99% of the population, for that matter. I mean, working people who rely one paycheck to the other. Yet we don't have the power in society. The political parties, both the Democrat and Republicans, they follow the tune of the big donors, the big corporations, the Bezos of this world. And we need a counterbalance to that. And we need to be able to fight back and push back against that.
So what are the downsides of unions? Why do employers, for example, fight against unions?
Well, that's absolutely self-evident. They'll say that, a union does nothing for you, and then they'll spend millions of dollars like you see in Amazon or in Starbucks to try to keep a union out. They don't want to pay people a livable wage. They don't want to have to guarantee that they're going to get good family sustaining benefits. They don't want to have to pay into a pension. They want to pay what the minimum rate will be to attract people, to keep them there for a little while before they leave and they bring somebody else in. Where what we want as working class people is we want the type of jobs you could raise families on. That's not a crazy notion. I mean, that's something that every single American, every single person in the world should be able to appreciate and understand. And that's what we want.
Does unionizing lead to companies putting more jobs overseas? Or why, for example, if you go on strike, why wouldn't could a company simply just fire you all and replace you all? Is that a fear that you have?
No, it's not a fear that I have. Without struggle, there can be no advancement, right? But you bring up, without risk, there is no reward. But you bring up a very good point, the overseas point. If we look at what's happened to this country in the last several decades, we've seen millions of jobs go overseas. I'm talking about manufacturing, point in case. Some jobs can never go overseas, right? If you're in the building trades, they can't outsource being an electrician. They can't outsource being a plumber. You have to have that here. But let's think about those manufacturing jobs. Millions of jobs gone because of NAFTA, right? Let's call a spade a spade. Who was the architect of the NAFTA? Bill Clinton. That was under his administration, the Democratic Party and Bill Clinton. So we have a huge problem with jobs going overseas. And not just that, it's not like those jobs are going overseas to be good, livable wage jobs. They're going to the bottom feeder places where workers have little, very few rights. This is a huge problem. One of the things that organized labor has to do a better job of, frankly, absolutely has to, is beginning to coordinate internationally with labor unions in Mexico, labor unions. Well, I'm not sure how free the labor unions are in China, but labor unions where they are, so we could coordinate these activities so they can't run to the place that's going to pay the least. And we have to get Americans, or for that matter, if you're from another country, the folks in your country, right, to come together and demand that these products that they buy be produced by fair labor standards in places where it's not a race to the bottom. But this is a huge problem, the outsourcing, the loss of jobs, and anybody that tries to diminish that or talks about how the new NAFTA, right, the new NAFTA that was done under Trump is somehow wonderful. It's not. It's still shitty. Free trade is a problem, and that's one of the reasons why voters, in my opinion, turned against the Democratic Party in the last several elections, because they did not, well, not the last election, but the ones before it, but they did not believe the Democrats when they said, yeah, we want to reform that too, because ultimately the Democrats, which are a neoliberal party, they're the ones who crafted that.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned coordinating with unions in other countries. Are there any people doing that? How would you do that? Because it seems like, especially in the places where labor is going, like China, the government really has a kind of a monopoly. You don't really have many unions. You do what they say, or they kind of just kill you. And so, in those kinds of countries, is a union even possible?
Yes, and I'll tell you. First of all, yes, there is some coordination going, but not to the extent that we need to see it happen. Not nearly to the extent. There's the International Labor Organization, right, that does seek to coordinate certain solidarity action between unions in different countries, but it's not remotely as effective as it needs to be. But getting to your question about a place where you're not allowed to organize or your life is on the line. Now, here's what we need to remember. I'm of the age where my grandparents were in the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, up into the New Deal, the same risks were involved with forming unions in the United States. People were killed, shot, clubbed, assassinated, lost their jobs. They went through more hell than we could imagine nowadays in order to form those unions. And it was during that time of massive repression, of physical threats and violence, that our country was able to unionize at a rate that it's never seen in its history. So with great repression comes great opportunity, because I do believe that it's in human nature to believe in liberty, to believe in the notion that it's worth fighting for, to have something better. And I believe this as a person, but I also believe this as a class, as a working class. So if we look at just our country alone, when the most repressive circumstances were in play, That's when we saw the rise of the labor movement. And it was later, after there was a false notion of comfort, that our labor movement began to decline. So if you ask me, say, in a country like Iran, right? Pick your country, where there's a repressive regime of some kind, is effective labor organizing possible? I'd say not only is it possible, but it's actually more probable. But that's not going to happen through state channels. That's not going to happen through fake unions that are supported by the government, like historically we saw in Mexico, which is starting to change. That's going to happen when workers, regular working people, get together and say enough is enough. This matters, not just to me, but to my children, my grandchildren, and those come later.
Do you have any examples of like countries overseas who have high labor unions, have high union rates, that you can see the results of having this better system?
Sure. I mean, look, if we look at the developed world and we look at Europe, for the most part, not every country, but for the most part, rates of unionization in Europe are high compared to America, astronomical. And what we see in Europe is basic living conditions being met, right? Things like housing, things like livable wages, things like having healthcare, having paid family medical leave. These type of things are part and parcel of what most of the industrialized developed world has. The United States of America is a bit of an anomaly in many ways. And the fact that most of us, myself included, are a couple paychecks away from disaster should put off alarm bells and should say, in the richest country in the world, we can do better. We could figure out a way to do better. And perhaps now is the time to talk about a new social contract, one that doesn't put the priority on the corporations, doesn't put the priority on the 200 wealthiest people in this country, but puts the priority on the person that goes to work 40 hours a week, right? That has calluses on their hand, that busts their ass for their family. That's the kind of priority we need to be set in, and making sure that you have dignity, security, and basic freedoms if you're a working class person.
Yeah, for sure. I think Sweden has like 80%, Finland has like 70%.
Mm-hmm.
I think America is like at 13% or something. Is that about right?
On a good day.
On a good
day. I think we're closer to 10% right now. But here's the thing. It's not all sob story. For the last several years, we've seen in Vermont, our membership go up. We've increased by a couple thousand members in the last couple of years, which in a population of only 600,000 is very significant. So the lessons to be learned here is, if we're not afraid to take a step back from some of the less effective electoralism in politics and party politics, and if we have the guts to say, okay, now's the time to actually organize and do the right thing and build connections with community organizations, build connections outside of the shop to really network and to grow that strength. There is a real opportunity here. Right now, Americans, the polls are saying that Americans are more favorable to unions right now than they have been in generations. And we see that with, I don't know what the number's at now, the over 100 Starbucks that have organized, which are young people. Some of these people are 17 years old, which is great, all across the country. Or the independent union of workers and only workers at Amazon in Staten Island. So this is a time where I could see a renaissance. The question is, will national union leaders have the balls, right, to make that turn, to change, and to seize the moment? That's an open question.
What kind of changes would they need to make?
Well, look, we need to democratize the labor movement. We need workers to feel that they have a true say in the policies and the politics of the labor movement. And we need to do that on a radical scale. So we've inherited 50 plus year old constitutions and bylaws and things like this. Right now, today, 500 delegates elect the national AFL-CIO president and the national officers. An organization of 12.5 million people, the largest labor organization in the United States. If there was a country that had 12.5 million citizens, and you told me they elected their president by 500 officers of some kind, I tell you, okay, that's clearly not a democracy, right?
Sounds like China.
Well, it certainly doesn't sound like what we talk about as democracy. But that's the bylaws that we inherited from a different time. We need to change that, because if I'm going to ask folks that work at a machine shop to go out on the picket line with me for something big that matters to all of us, if I'm going to ask folks to go to a demonstration, if I'm going to ask folks to take their Sunday and fight for something better, they need to feel that that's them, that that's part of them. And if we create these divisions between union officers, right, who get to decide right now who's in charge, versus the workers themselves making these decisions, we're not going to hit that critical mass of mobilization and activism and engagement that we need to hit. So this is probably somewhat controversial, me saying this as an AFL-CIO officer, but it's just fucking true. And I'll tell you another thing, that here in Vermont, we've done what we can to try to open up the process. We've invited consistently our membership to attend all of our leadership meetings. We've doubled the amount of seats on our leadership board, which they get to elect. We've more than doubled the amount of delegates they get to send to a convention. And we want to, it's in our platform, to have our members directly elect all the officers. Even though we doubled the delegates, it's still delegates. But that's not currently allowed until we change the national bylaws in the national AFL-CIO. So that's something we struggle towards too. But I don't want to come off that I'm a pessimist. I believe that the AFL-CIO and the labor movement will be and has to be the catalyst for foundational change in this country. But for us to succeed at that, we have to also succeed in changing ourselves culturally and politically from within.
What would it take to change the bylaws? Is that just like take a majority of the 500 you mentioned essentially to do that?
2/3 majority. But first you have to get something to be allowed for a vote. So I just came back. I was a delegate to the National AFL-CIO convention, as well as Liz Medina, executive director, who's a member of the UAW. We were there representing Vermonters. In Philadelphia, not more than a few weeks ago, our state labor council submitted 2 resolutions to be considered by the delegates who are present. And there are several thousand people there, union folks, union members, but there's essentially 500 voting delegates. Keep that in mind. So we submitted them. They were adopted by our executive board, and we sent them along. And they represent the will of our members, because we've had in-depth conversations with our members about these issues. One of them was to take steps now to prepare for a national general strike if there is another coup attempt in the wake of the next presidential election. Leave that on the side for a minute. The other resolution was exactly what you're talking about, to change our Constitution to allow for the direct 12.5 million members to elect national officers. Now, there's a bit of a process with that. So what we asked in the resolution is that for the process to begin and for that to be voted on by the delegates at the next convention, which happens every several years. We had national support from a couple unions, international unions, big unions for this. The postal workers, APWU, and their president, Mark Diamondstein, at least in spirit, liked some of the things we were talking about and thought they were important things to be discussed. However, the governing council of the National AFL-CIO, the executive council, decided that that was not going to be allowed to be voted on and debated in any free format by the delegates present. So the irony was not lost on us that a motion, a resolution to create real democracy within the AFL-CIO was undemocratically not allowed to become even before the delegates. But here we saw this as a start. We're under no illusions, and change takes time. Sometimes it takes time, sometimes that happens fast, but change can take time. And so we use that as an opportunity, myself and Director Medina, to stand up before all the delegates and various international presidents from all across the country to say that's not right. And God damn it, it's time that we actually not fear our rank and file, but embrace them and make sure the rank and file is direct say, like in the UAW, which just went to direct elections for national officers. And that's the direction we need to go to if we're going to build a more robust and more powerful labor movement in this country. And I'll tell you what, we didn't get our vote from the floor. That was controlled. But we had many presidents and leaders from different state labor councils from across the country come to us and start to have that dialogue. So now that door has been open, and we plan on pursuing that, and we plan on fighting for a democratization of the labor movement on the broad national scale.
So what was the reason? Why wouldn't they allow the vote? Like, who's to blame for that? And is there any rational reason why they shouldn't support that?
Well, I don't want to put specific motivation into individuals, right? I don't want to attribute to them without firsthand knowledge. So they had the authority to do this because what happens is right now through the old system is resolutions that are submitted by any state labor council such as ours go to a resolutions committee, and they vote to either bring them to the floor or they could refer them for further discussion to the governing executive council. In this case, our two resolutions were referred for more discussion to the executive council. And when that council met, they chose not to discuss them. They chose to pass them over. One of our allies from one of the internationals stood up and basically said, this is bullshit. This is not the way to do things. But the votes weren't there from, a small group, relatively small group of national leaders to do that. Now, I know I said I wouldn't speculate, but here's the thing. If you're comfortable in the position you are, and if you think things are going well, right? Or if you're under some illusion that we're winning as a working class people in this country, or that it's good enough, then it's not in your interest to rock the boat. See, myself and my slate, United, we don't believe that nationally we're winning. We believe by and large working people are losing in this country, and we're losing every year. There's bright spots. Our growth here in Vermont is a bright spot, and there's plenty of bright spots. The warehouse in Staten Island, SEIU organizing the Starbucks, there's plenty, but we're not winning. So we believe very firmly that we need to do things different. And if that means rocking the boat, so be it, because I have no intention of sitting in a chair and watching the ship sink. We need to fix this ship, even if it's at sea, which is hard to do. But that's the hard work necessary to come out the other side somewhere stronger, somewhere better, somewhere where working people are more secure in this country.
One of the things I would think, like to steelman the opposing position, I do that a lot as a debater,
Absolutely.
is it maybe they were just too busy. Maybe they had something more important to discuss. Do you think, was there like a public access where they could see like all the topics? Because if they were discussing like what's the favorite bird or something as an alternative, and that's a pretty clear case.
Maybe you're right, and maybe my perception is wrong, and that's fair.
But is it public, the things they did decide to discuss?
It was public, at least to those at the convention, right? Like there's a list of things that were not considered and were considered. But here's the interesting thing. So we voted on, at the National Convention in Philly, we voted on, I don't know, a couple dozen resolutions, however many it was. And in a room full of folks, for the most part, almost to a T, almost every resolution passed unanimously. So if your focus is to affirm that the sky is blue, and that's your overriding drive for why we're coming together all across the country, all 50 states, to debate and finally solidify and finally end the question of what color is the sky, then they succeeded at their mission, and they did a great job at it, right? But if your goal is to actually have real debate and really wrestle with difficult things, then, that didn't happen at the convention. Now, I'm loyal to the AFL-CIO. Everything I'm saying because I believe it's necessary to air it. It's necessary to say it, right? But at the end of the day, I'm AFL-CIO through and through. But the incarnation we have now is not good enough. It's not meeting the challenges of our times. It needs to be stronger. It needs to be better. And for that, we need some votes to go 51, 49. Like we need to be able to talk about hard things, not just easy things.
Absolutely. Do you know how the countries you mentioned earlier that have a large unionized base, what do they do differently that makes them more effective at being a union?
Well, countries are different, and it really depends on what country you're talking about. In Germany, if I recall, or certainly in France, they do sector-wide bargaining. So a union might have bargaining against the employers or with the state, et cetera, about what the terms and conditions will be for truckers, right, in a broad way. Where I think some of the strengths and weaknesses of our culture as Americans is our individualism, right? And at times, I think that serves us well. I think that served us well for a number of centuries. But at other times, it leads us to becoming more in our own silos, which makes it harder. So instead of negotiating a contract for all the truckers in the country that uplifts them, we'll negotiate dozens and dozens and dozens of different contracts, all different, with different trucking firms. So if you're focused too much on the bread and butter of your individual shop, you end up or you risk losing the the forest for the trees. So that's something I think we need to struggle with as Americans. But like, there's also the myth of the rugged individualism too. So let's not forget that the American Revolution wasn't won because a couple individual people did some gallant things, right? We came together as a people. We beat the Nazis in World War II by coming together as a country and being united on that. So there's these competing traditions. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I think that we have to start thinking more as Americans as a whole, as a working class as a whole, in what's in our common interest together and how do we achieve that together. But if we struggle for these things individually or in small little unions, then we risk also playing the shell game and not getting to the end of the story.
So why do you think America does have such a low unionized rate compared to the European countries? How did they encourage their workers to actually unionize at that rate?
Well, in many ways too, we've traditionally been, compared to much of the world, a very ultra-capitalist country, right? And built into that or baked into that is the myth of the rugged individualism too. So there's a lot of competing factors, but more concretely, more recently, after we had the great, huge society-changing wins of the New Deal, and as we got into the 1950s, where union membership hits its peak, and at that time too, up through the 1960s, the standards of living were increasing, and you could see that in real wage growth. But there comes a point where instead of getting behind certain politicians because they really back us, we started getting behind a party because it's a party and it was part of a strategy. Now I'm getting back to the Democrats, and anything they say about the Democrats, don't take that as that I support the Republicans, because I don't. But we start getting behind the Democrats, who then they start becoming the ones to make reactionary change. They start becoming the ones that say, well, it's the Clintons of the world, or even later the Obamas of the world, that say, well, tell you what, maybe we're against obviously evil things, but maybe we could change this, and maybe we could have this free trade agreement over here and this free trade agreement over there. And, it's no mystery. I mean, these folks who are high up in the Democratic Party, and I'm not talking about Joe Blow or Jane Doe, who's a member of the Democrats. I'm talking about those with real power, the Nancy Pelosi's, the Chuck Schumers, the Barack Obamas, the Joe Bidens, despite their rhetoric on the campaign trail, how much they love unions, despite their rhetoric of they're going to stand up for the working people, show me some examples when they actually do. Show me some examples where they've gone to the mat and they didn't just throw up their hands and say, oh, we can't do it first time they run into a little hiccup. Now, if the Democrats really wanted to support organized labor as a party, right, as an actual party, they would have done away with the filibuster to pass the PRO Act, which would have greatly increased the ability of workers to form unions in this country. But instead, you had Sinema and Joe Manchin, say, no, we're not going to do that, right? But here's the thing. There's always going to be a Sinema and Manchin. That's their excuse. That's their foil. So they could keep getting the money from the big fat cats, the industrialists, the rich, the powerful, right? They could keep getting that money. And on the campaign trail, they could talk rhetoric about the working class, and they talk rhetoric about supporting unions, but they never actually really have to do it in a way that foundationally changes the game. They tinker with the edges. They'll make some good appointments to some labor boards. They'll do a few good things, but nothing that changes the game in any fundamental way. That's the problem. Where take the Republicans, though, right? Because they're their own story. Republicans, for the most part, don't fuck around. They just say, fuck you. I don't like the unions, and you go fuck yourself, right? But now, after so many years of Democratic letdowns, why do you think people elected Trump in 2016? They elected Trump in 2016 because he said a bunch of crazy shit, right? And in my mind, he's an evil son of a bitch. But he said the system's fucked, and I don't give a shit about it, and I'm going to be a radical break for that. So when there's not an actual working class poll, when there's not an actual alternative being framed by the unions, by other groups, right? When it's just the Democrats or something else, occasionally when people are sick and tired of things, they're going to turn to something else. And that something else could be really fucking bad, as we just saw and we're seeing with the hearings with the near coup that went on that was nearly successful in Washington, D.C. not that long ago.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like there's a lot of policies and politics that prevent actual change, like the filibuster for sure, and the two-party voting system. The first past the post voting system seems to be a big one, because you're not really voting for the candidate you believe in. You're voting for the person who's less bad than the other guy, whatever their policies may be.
Yes, and that's such a scam. That's just such a terrible way to do things. Now, I am happy to say that in Vermont, we joke sometimes that it's the People's Republic of Vermont because it's a little different. But we have a true three-party system, meaning that it's not just Democrats and Republicans that get elected. We have a caucus of, we have a third party called the Progressive Party, which has about 10 people elected to the state house. And until recently, the lieutenant governor was from the Progressive Party, and presently our auditors from the Progressive Party. That party has always been true to their word when it comes to working class folks and unions. And they've stood with us. And as the AFL-CIO of Vermont has turned our back on those that really don't get our backs, we've shaken hands with them, and we've worked increasingly with them. And when you have options, when you have third parties, fourth parties, for that matter, I want to see 10 parties, then I think that makes what we call the two major parties better parties, because they have to compete with other ideas. And that's something we don't currently have in the United States. But this still goes back to the corporations, right? And the corporate backers and the rich, because they're going to be damn sure that enough money goes to the resources go to the Republicans and Democrats, and both MSNBC and Fox News are going to give so much airtime to those two parties that it's hard to create breathing room on a national scale for third, fourth, fifth party options.
Yeah,
so
for
it's
sure.
a hard fight. It's a hard fight, but it's a fight we have to have and we have to win.
Yeah, and so one of the big concerns is that since you're taking your money and not giving it to lobbying, and lobbying seems to be one of the major motivational factors for politicians, it seems like you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot in a way. How do you make up for that lost influence in politics without using lobbying?
Great question. A couple things with that. One a little practical, and one a little different. So when United came to power in Vermont, our track record for the last several years was about zero in the state house, when we were spending money on extra lobbyists and we were putting more time and resources in the state house. We had several high priority bills that went nowhere. Okay, so our starting point was zero. So when we came in and we took money out of lobbying, and we created a new endorsement policy based on party, not individual, party, that says, look, we're just going to tell you what our three priorities are for a biennium, for a 2-year period. And each party is free to follow them or not. But if you don't pass them and your party as a party doesn't back them, then there's going to be a moratorium on us endorsing anybody from your party for a cycle for the state house. Right? There's a couple of provisions with very rare cases. We could override that with a 2/3 vote, right? But generally speaking, that's how it is. So the first year we came to office, we made progress towards a $15 an hour livable wage. We got that up to, over a period of years to $12.55 an hour. That was one of our priorities. We passed a new, more fair system of worker misclassification enforcement, which was important to the trades. That passed and became law. And the third part was card check, a more free, democratic way to be allowed to form a union that doesn't give the advantages to the boss. That did not pass. So we made progress on 2 out of 3, which is already much better than what we had when we were spending more money in the state house. But because they didn't do all the things that we said, the moratorium was triggered on both the Republicans and Democrats. So for the last couple cycles, we have backed the Progressive Party slate and not them. I say this to say, look, we were getting nothing, and now we got something, right? So our experience is not that we've suffered as a result. But here's the other example. not an AFL-CIO union, but the NEA and another union up here called, it's independent, the Vermont State Employees Association, represent state workers and teachers and school workers. They have their own pension systems. And because both Republicans, Democrats for a period of decades were underfunding the contributions, they were facing problems, those funds. The workers paid in every penny that was asked for them, every single penny, but willfully and in a way that is clear. This is no speculation here. The various administrations of both parties at different times said, we don't have to pay in this year. So what happens after a couple of decades gap, right? It doesn't take an economist to figure out how that goes. So when they were facing a serious situation, the Democratic Party came out with support from the Republican governor, and they said, all right, we're going to make workers work several years longer. We're going to charge them a lot more for their contributions, and we're going to reduce what they get in their old age, right, to live on. And that was totally unacceptable. So here's the thing, the workers themselves, and a lot of this was done outside the structure of the official uniondom. They organized a number of pickets all around the state and a mass rally, big in our terms, of 500 folks on the State House lawn. The Democrats quickly changed their tune when they saw how angry and how mobilized the workers were. So that bill went away, the one that would have gutted the pension. And what we saw this year happen was a very modest set of changes that frankly was acceptable to shore up the funding of the bill, and a number of one-time money, especially when money came from the feds during the COVID relief time, going in to shore up those funds. So that's an example of where it's not lobbyists or suits and ties that had the impact. It was workers getting mad and doing what they had to do to show that, like, look, we're everywhere. We're in every community in the state, and we have families, right? We have parents, grandparents, we have children, adult children, we have cousins, we have friends, and we're going to make you pay if you screw us, because we did what you asked us to do, and we made our contributions. You didn't do what you said you were going to do, and now if you want to fuck us now, we're going to make you pay. So that's the way I see us long-term building power, not having coffee or whiskey with Chuck Schumer. Speaking of whiskey.
So what are your current goals? What is your union currently working on to help workers who are a part of your union?
At any given time, we have several dozen projects going on at once. But over the last few weeks, like many Americans, we've been very disturbed about the Supreme Court decision with Roe versus Wade. We feel, without doubt, without hesitation, that women's rights are workers' rights. And what we see being attacked now, as far as a woman's right to control her body, is absolutely unacceptable. We have, in November, we're going to be voting as Vermonters on a constitutional change, a state constitutional change, guaranteeing a woman the right to control her own body. So over the last few days, I've been involved. I've been thinking about that. I spoke at a rally in Montpelier a couple of days ago in support of women's rights. One of our vice presidents, Katie Harris, also spoke at a like rally for women's rights and the right to control their own bodies in Burlington at the same time. And I anticipate that we're going to have a resolution at our August convention fully supporting this constitutional change and putting resources and effort into making sure that passes and making sure that women are adequately protected in our state.
Awesome. Yeah, I actually have a really interesting or a hot take on that. My position is I think that the privacy ruling on Roe versus Wade is not really strong enough. I think that it should be a self-defense issue. Like, I think that pregnancy without any complications counts as like great bodily harm, which would then justify use of lethal force of self-defense anyway. And I think that would be the more adequate ruling that we should hope for comes about in the upcoming trials that are definitely going to occur.
That's interesting, but I also I don't want to put too much emphasis on. I don't want to put too much faith, I should say, in the Supreme Court. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think buried under the Roe versus Wade decision a day before is the Supreme Court also got rid of Miranda rights, if I recall correctly. So I don't think that Roe versus Wade and Miranda rights are the end here, right? And this is by orchestration. So what is it that we're going to need to do to build the power needed, to define what the priorities are and not have them defined by us, by a court or by a corporation? That's the question.
Yeah. And I don't know. because the lifetime term, no term limits on the Supreme Court definitely makes it a really tricky issue of how
But
exactly we're going to deal with that. And I think the Supreme Court also just recently ruled that public schools teachers can lead prayer openly also, which is a
that's right.
concerning one.
That's right. Which is, one likes to think that part and parcel of the Constitution is separation of church and state, and so that's being eroded too. And that's not, when I say it's not meant to be a slap at those who have religious beliefs whatsoever, right? But if we're going to see a dismantling of what the vision is of being in a republic, to be in a democracy, to be Americans, then I think we have to do a real deep look to ourselves, and what are we willing to do to stand up against this? And there's no right answer, but there are a lot of wrong answers.
Yeah, for sure. So, how do people become members of a union? How do they contribute to a union? And what are the obligations of union members? What are they? What are their things they are meant to actually do as a member?
Well, generally speaking, if you, let's say you work in a warehouse and 100 people work there, your first step is to getting together with a few trusted coworkers and saying, hey, people you trust, and say, look, what do you think could be better here? Right? That's the starting question. This is all about making things better. Is the healthcare provision good enough? Is the equipment we have safe? Is there something that we need to fix? If you live in utopia, so be it, but most of us don't. So once you identify what some of those problems are, get together your coworkers, form an organizing committee, and then start to branch out and have those discussions, right? I would recommend you also reach out to a local established union to give you help once you get to that point. If you were to do that in Vermont, then we would potentially assign an organizer to help you, or to get you in touch with one of our affiliates to directly work with you, who has the know-how to help guide you through some of the process. At the end of the day, there's different ways to get recognition. One is through a labor board election, which is secret ballot, and a majority has to vote for the union. The other way some people do is they demand voluntary recognition, or even go on strike to achieve recognition, right? These are decisions that the workers have to make themselves. There's risk and reward involved with all of them. But once you get recognition, and once you negotiate your first fair contract, right, that's the big first step. And once you have that in place, then your responsibility is to be a true union brother and sister, right? Look out for your coworkers. Look out for the person on the line next to you. Do the best goddamn job you could, because we're not here to protect the bad worker. We're here to do the best goddamn job possible, because we want to show that union labor could produce the best products in the world, for that matter. So then the other thing we have to think about are these big questions that me and you have been tackling. How do you leverage that with other unions, with other shops, with other working class people, to first define what the priorities are, first define what it is that you believe collectively, and then how do we effectively fight to achieve them?
For sure. And is there a way for people to contribute to unions if they can't afford to pay membership dues?
Well, first of all, anybody that's in the union, right, they're going to win a raise that's bigger than they've seen before, and they'll be able to afford the dues, no problem, as a result of that. But if you're not in a union, let's just say you're not in a union, but you want to be supportive, right? If you lived in Vermont, you would call us up. We have plenty of things to do, right? We have plenty of things that we could be working on that we would love to have your volunteer services for, to help build a movement. Because we're not just looking to represent just the folks that are paying union dues. We're looking to represent working class people, right? And working class people is the great majority, but our interests are largely overlooked. So we don't just fight for that extra 25 cents an hour and that extra deal on the premium in healthcare, right? We do that, but we also want to uplift everybody and really give us ourselves a voice. And we envision a time when union membership is not going to be 10%, 15%, 20%, but let's get it up to where it is in other places, like 80, 90%. And then you'll see real change in this country.
Awesome. Do you want to give links and references where people can find out more about yourself, your program, everything you're working on?
I'd be happy to. Look, if you just do an internet search for the Vermont AFL-CIO, our website will come up. If you click About Us, our 10-point program for union power will come up, which is our platform, also called the Little Green Book. that talks about what we're aiming to do, how we intend to achieve it, and the things that we've been engaged in. So I would welcome folks to do that. They're free to reach out to us if you want to talk about how you could create a progressive united slate in your state if you're already a union member, or just to talk about how to form a union.
Awesome. It was great having you on. We've been going for about an hour, so I want to wrap up. If there's anything else you want to bring up.
That's great, Tom. It was a pleasure being with you.
Absolutely. Great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on, and I will let you go. Hope you have a wonderful day.
All right, you take care.